We will be writing a linear equation using our y equals mx plus b. So some things that we need to know are that we have our two variables. The x's are independent variable. Our y is our dependent variable. And at times they ask us, so y equals is in the form of, they'll have at different times different questions about how, and one very popular way to ask is y as a function of x. And they'll ask you to write an equation, a linear equation, of y as a function of x. And this wording sometimes trips people up, but that just means y equals mx plus b. So having your independent variable and your dependent variable, and for linear, it would be your slope. So m is our slope. And remember, with our slope, it is always the change in y over the change in x. So we will have to calculate it, or sometimes it's given to us, but that's where it goes in front of our independent variable. We also have our y-intercept. And remember, our y-intercept is a coordinate pair. It is a point on the graph, 0, and then whatever that number is. And sometimes the y-intercept is given. We can always find that if x is 0, or later on we will have to calculate that. So those are the key things that we need to find and calculate. So now if we have some examples, here we have our slope of -3, and I noticed that my y-intercept, it does state it, but it's 1/2. That 0 determines that it is the y-intercept when x is always 0. So we will set it up as y equals m, which is our slope, -3x plus the 1/2. And that is our equation with our slope and our y-intercept, because when x is 0, when our independent variable is 0, that zeroes this part out, and we're left with 1/2 as our y-intercept. So that is an equation written y as a function of x. Now, when we have a slope of 0 and a y-intercept of 0, we can substitute the same way, y equals mx plus b. When we have 0 in for m, bring down our x, and we have our 0 in for b. So 0 times x is 0 plus 0 is 0. So now if we take a look at this 0 right here, well, that 0 is the same as this 0. And we have lots of zeros, so a lot of people think, it doesn't matter which 0 it is, but it really does. Just like up here, this 1/2 was this position for b. So this b, and when we added it to the 0, it was the 1/2 for our y-intercept. So this 0 is a specific number, which is this 0 right here. And that correlates with this 0 right here. So this 0 is our y-intercept when x, because this is our x equals 0, when x equals 0 for the y-intercept, because that's stated right here. This 0 for slope is not this 0 or this 0, it's the 0 slope in here. And if you can kind of think about it, that this would have a kind of a plus 0x as a slope in there, but it zeroes out, and that's why that is. So our equation for this is a horizontal line, because it's a 0 slope with our slope guy, and it's a horizontal line at y equals 0. Moving on to writing equations from graphs. Again, we'll need our equation y equals mx plus b. And from that, we need to find our y-intercept, and our y-intercept is when x is always 0. So I will find my y-intercept on the y-axis when x is 0 right here. So that point of 3 is our y-intercept, and our slope we will need, which is the change in y over the change in x. So we want to make sure we write that down every single time so we don't switch them, because the change in y has to be on top. So we need to find 2 points that are nice crosshairs, and I see one right here. So I will choose that point and that point. Now the change in y, I'm going to go over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's a positive 6. Oh, but that is the change in x, not the change in y. So that plus 6 goes in the denominator. Then we go down 2. So direction matters. So for slope, so negative 2 in the numerator. So when I simplify that, I get a slope of negative 1/3 as my slope. So now I can write my equation for this line. Y equals negative 1/3 x plus 3. And that is y as a function of x. Now when we get a little bit more complicated, it's writing an equation from points. So there's a couple ways we can do this. We can, I noticed that when x equals 0, this is my y-intercept. So I don't have to go calculating that. It's right there given to us. Though I do have to find my slope. And slope is m equals the change in y over the change in x. We'll write that down for each one of these. And I find for myself, instead of using the formula, I find that I make less errors when I make and use a table. So I'm going to take and write my coordinate pairs in a table, and that just helps me think about, well, on a number line, if I go 5, starting at 5, going down to 1, negative 1, so that would be 5 to 0, then one more would be a negative 6. And from negative 3 to a 0 is a positive 3. So it also helps me make sure I get my numbers in the right part of the fraction, the slope fraction. So the x is positive 3 in the denominator and negative 6 in the numerator. So that simplifies to a slope of negative 2. So now I can write my y as a function of x. So y equals negative 2 for my slope, x minus 1. And we'll do one more example of that. Here is my y-intercept, because I noticed that x is 0 right here. So that is my y-intercept. My slope, which I will calculate. And this time, you know what? Instead of doing a table, you can do a table if you like that way. I'm going to do that. Slope is the y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. So when we substitute those in, we have to be very careful that we have subtraction and that we put our points in correctly. So this is our x and our y. I'll just choose this point. It doesn't matter which point you choose, but I'll choose this point as my point 2, the one up front. So my y value, notice I had to pause to really think about, okay, y is not the first one but the second one, and 8 is the x value. Then I will substitute in my other point, negative 5, in my numerator and 0 in my denominator. So this is where a lot of people make their errors, because they just calculate a negative 10 here. But actually, if we take a look at changing subtraction to adding the opposite, that makes this negative a positive plus a 5. So that would be 0 in the numerator and 8 in the denominator. So that would have a slope of 0 divided by 8 is the calculation of 0. So we're going to take our equation, so our slope of 0, y equals mx plus b, and y equals 0x plus a negative 5. So we don't leave it in this form because it's kind of unsimplified, just like our fractions would be unsimplified if we didn't simplify them down. So 0 times any number is 0 plus negative 5 equals negative 5. And that's a horizontal line, kind of what we did before. We thought about that. It's a horizontal line at negative 5 on our graph down here at that negative 5 because it has a slope of 0, and we can see that inside of our equation there. Well, it's hidden inside of our equation. So now if we look at how does this work with a function notation, and remember when we did these graphs, remember when we had to graph a bunch of them, that's where that function notation came in handy, was being able to label them. So out of that came function notation. So what I like to think about first is that function notation is f of x, and you can see that this is my 6 for my x part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my table and calculate my slope from my table. So I'm going to get that 6 in the x column because that's what I was thinking about first. That means the 34 is our y. Now, a lot of people are like, well, why is the 34 the y? Because it's function notation in that if we think of that f of x equals, we can think about that as our y. That is our y, our outputs. F of x is the y. So that y equals 34, and that's the reason why that side is the y value of 34. So if I kind of go back over to this one the first function notation, and I notice that that 0 is in an important spot. That's our x equals 0, and that is our y-intercept. So right here, y-intercept of 10. Well, 0, 10. So now I've got my part of my equation. I can leave a little space for my slope x plus 10. So I can put that in my B position. And I kind of noticed that this time I'd like to go up because that makes it a positive. And from my 10 to 4, remember we have to go the same direction with our slope. So 10 to 34 is a positive 24. So slope m equals the change in y over the change in x equals the y value, the y change is 24 over 6, which is 4. So my slope is 4x plus 10. So y equals 4x plus 10, and that is a y as a function of x.